Welcome to the Ixware North America Technical Webcast Series. In this video, we're going to talk about integrating your enterprise server with Active Directory using Ixware's LDAP module. So before I dive into the LDAP settings and what we're going to need to do there, I want to talk for just a minute about why we would want to integrate with Active Directory or with another LDAP server for that matter. And the primary reason to do that is when we have a large number of individual users that we want to set up within the Ixware server. So maybe you have a large number of users at your organization and you want each of them to have their own dedicated inbound fax number. Now if you were to do that manually, you would have to go here to the Users section in the Ixware workspace, and you'd have to start up the new user wizard, and for each user you would have to go through that process to create the user and then the mailbox, of course assign the fax number as a transport on that mailbox, and then when you were done you'd have to go to the mailboxes and you'd have to select a new user, go to the mailbox rules, and then create a new rule for each user to forward the inbound faxes to that user's email address or print it at a printer, whatever you were going to do. So you can see if you have more than a handful of users, that's going to become a tedious process. In addition to that, when we're dealing with a large number of users, there's a good possibility that we're also in a situation where fax numbers may get reassigned as people move around in different departments, or somebody leaves the organization and a new employee comes in. And when that happens, if you're doing this manually, if you're configuring all your users manually, you would have to go in and manually delete the users, delete the mailboxes, add the user in the mailbox for the new user, reassign the fax number, so on and so forth. So you can see that that process would become quite tedious. If you can integrate with Active Directory, you can actually automate a large portion of this process by allowing Ixware to scan your Active Directory server and pull users based on some specific criteria, like the fax number that's been entered in the user profile, which is what I'm going to show you today. And so anytime we find a user that has a fax number, we're going to set that user up in the system. We're automatically going to create the user, the mailbox, and the routing rule for you. And if you ever go in to the Active Directory settings for that user and you remove the fax number, the next time Ixware syncs with your Active Directory server, we're going to recognize that that user is no longer in the list, and we're going to remove all of their settings from Ixware for you. So it's going to make management of your users much easier. So we'll go ahead and show you how to do that now. All of this is going to be happening from within the Ixware workspace, so we just need to make sure that you're in that application. And then we want to go to Modules, and in the modules list you should see LDAP. So I'm going to double click on that now, and I'm going to take you through most of these tabs. And on the very first tab you can see there's a button here for Active Directory, and there's also one for Domino LDAP, and these are just the two most common LDAP servers that we connect to. And as I said, today we're going to be talking about Active Directory. If you push one of these two buttons, we're going to set up some rules in the connection and synchronization tabs that are going to work with Active Directory and or Domino LDAP. So if you want to go ahead, you can push the Active Directory button now, and that's going to preset your configuration for Active Directory. I already have some configuration settings in mind, so I'm not going to do that, but if you haven't done this before, if you're just setting up for the first time, you're going to go ahead and click Active Directory and then select OK. And below that you're going to see a dial profile setting, and you have two options here, default connection and default protocol. This is the dial profile that you've chosen to use in if you you go here to, I'm going to show you in Domain Manager really quickly. In the Agent module, there are two dial profiles, default connection, default protocol. You can choose to use either of those when setting up your either telephony or brook trout fax module. So whichever one you're using, you want to select that here, and that's going to be used for number normalization when creating the mailboxes and creating the call routing rules. So now we're going to switch over to the connection tab, and your connection tab is going to be blank when you start out, but I've already set this up so you can see some of the information that's necessary. In the server information here at the top, we need an IP address, or you could also use a fully qualified domain name of your Active Directory server. I think the IP address is the easier choice. You need a port number. The 389 is the default, which is what we're using, but if you're using a custom port, you need to enter that here. And then you need to let us know if your server requires a secure connection. After that, in the authentication section, you need to choose what kind of authentication you have. Secure password authentication is a standard, though you can also do clear text or no login required if you didn't have a login. I suspect that most all of you are going to use secure password authentication. You then need an account name and a password. Now these don't have to have write access, but they do need, of course, read access. You need to be able to pull Active Directory. And then finally, you need the name of the domain that you're going to be connecting to. So once all of that is entered, we can flip over here to the Synchronization tab. On the Synchronization tab, there's a search base at the top, and now this by default is probably going to be blank. But it's fairly easy. You can, if you don't know, if you're familiar with the Active Directory schema, you can just go ahead and type this in here. But if you don't know what that is, the easiest way to find that is to hit this Browse button. And when you do that, it's going to ask if you want to save the changes you've made before continuing. And you can go ahead and tell it yes. And you're going to get an Active Directory browser. And now if you've entered all of your information correctly on the Connection tab here, then you should be able to browse out to your domain. And I can see my domain here, infoviewsystems.com. And if I open that up, I can select my users folder and click OK, and that's going to populate your search base for you. Now the scope here, you probably want to leave at subtree. Now the more detailed you can make this, so if I can force this into the container users inside my domain and I tell it I just want to search that subtree, you're going to speed up the process of looking for the users that you want to integrate. I could leave this just at infoviewsystems.com and I could tell it first level below base entry or base entry, and I could make the server work a little bit to find what I'm looking for, but the more detailed I can make it, the faster the sync is going to be. Now in addition to the main search base here, I also want to click the advanced button because I want to use this filters tab to be very specific about the users that I bring in. Now by default there are some filters that are automatically listed, and they are going to start with this class equals user and class equals person. So we're going to look for any users. We're going to look for users specifically that are people. We are not going to look for anything that is a class of computer, and we are not going to look for administrators. Now I've added an additional filter here that you can see, and that is facsimile telephone number equals, and I'm using the asterisk. And basically what that's going to do is that's going to tell Ixware to only look for users who have something entered in the fax number field. And I think this is by far the easiest way to filter your users in Active Directory, assuming that only users with a fax number are going to be pulled into Ixware, and that all users with a fax number are going to be pulled into Ixware. So if you had users and you've already entered fax numbers for many of them or all of them, but you didn't necessarily want those users entered into Ixware, you would need to use a different search criteria. And it is possible to create custom criteria in Active Directory. So you could actually create a custom field. You could populate it with the word Ixware, for example, and then you could use that custom field in the filter. But for our example, I'm going to stick with the facsimile telephone number equals asterisk. And I'm going to click OK there. And if you add that field, what you can do is you can use the check button here to check the number of users that Ixware is going to find when it does a sync. And so if you click the check button, again, it's going to ask you if you want to save changes before performing this operation, and you click yes. It's going to come up and tell me right now that it has one matching search filter. And this, if we've set our connection up correctly, if we have our filters set correctly, in this case I'm only pulling users who have a fax number entered, and since we don't enter fax numbers for all of the users by default, I've only pulled the one user, my user in this case, for which I have. This is a really handy way to make sure that your filters are working exactly the way you want before you do an actual sync and pull in a lot of data or potential users that you don't need in the system. You can use this username field to search for specific usernames. So if we had pulled up, say, 10, 20, 30 users, I could type a username here, see if it populates in the list so that I can check and sort of do a manual verification of all the users that have been pulled in. So I'm going to go ahead and close that window now. And once I know that my filters are working in the advanced section, I can check now for my synchronization options. By default, this automatically synchronize using the schedule is unchecked. You're probably going to want to turn that on. And then you can also go in here to options and you can set your synchronization. So you can pick your starting hour, and this is 24-hour format, so 0 being, basically 12 midnight, 23 being 11 p.m. And then you can pick your interval, again in 24-hour time period here, 1 through 24. At what interval do you want to sync? So I'm saying I want to start my sync at 11 p.m. and I want to sync every 8 hours. And you can really set this to whatever you want. It doesn't matter. What this affects is how often we pull Active Directory. And the difference that's going to make for you is if you make a change, if I left my settings this way and I made a change at 11:05 a.m. or 11:05 p.m., then I wouldn't get that sync for nearly 8 hours. Right? I would have to have made the change already before the sync happens. So if I'm only polling the Active Directory server every 8 hours, I'm not going to get changes that often. That may be appropriate for your organization, or you may want to lower this. You may want to make this every 4 hours or even every 2 hours, depending on how quickly or how often you want those changes to update. Be warned, however, that the more often you pull your Active Directory server, especially if you have a very large user base that Ixware has to search through, you're going to slightly slow down the processing of the Ixware server while the LDAP integration takes place. So you want to set this to an interval that's appropriate, but not so low that you're pulling this constantly, especially if you have a very large user base. So once you have your synchronization set here, I'm going to point out one more option on the bottom, and that is this: do not delete users and mailboxes if they no longer exist on the LDAP server. I generally recommend that you leave this unchecked, and the reason for that is that I want my Active Directory server to function as my user management. And when I say that, I mean that if I were to go in and I do my check here again, I can see that I've pulled this user, Jason Whitefoot, because it matches my search criteria, my filter criteria. It has a fax number. And if I went in and deleted the fax number from my user account in Active Directory, I don't want Ixware to find that user anymore. And if it doesn't find that user, I want Ixware to actually remove the user, the mailbox, and the routing rule, the contact. I want it to pull all of that information back out of Ixware. That makes it possible for me to completely manage my users in Ixware from Active Directory simply by adding or removing the fax number. It also means that if I move a fax number from one user to the other, the old user will be completely removed from Ixware, and at the next synchronization the new user will be added with that fax number. So in order for that to happen, I need to leave this checkbox off. Okay, once we're done here on the synchronization tab, we need to click over to mapping. And in mapping you can see that I have a couple columns here: LDAP, contact, and mailbox. Now the LDAP fields are all of the fields from Active Directory that we have mapped by default. And if you remember back at the beginning, I said we had a couple of buttons, the Active Directory button and the Domino LDAP button. And this is one of the areas that that button helps pre-configure. So it goes into Active Directory, looks at a list of standard Active Directory schema and maps it to the contact that's going to get created in Ixware. And by default, if you're using Active Directory, this is probably all pretty much standard. You probably don't have to make too many changes, if any, to the contact field. What you are going to need to add is a mailbox field for at least the fax number. Assuming we're creating users with their own inbound fax DIDs, we do need to add the fax number as a transport in the mailbox. And you do that by highlighting the facsimile telephone number entry, going to the properties, and under the mailbox transport, which is blank by default, but it defaults to none, we want to select fax and then click OK. And when we do that, the fax number is going to be added to the contact, but it's also going to be added as a transport to the mailbox. That's what's going to allow inbound faxes to that user's fax number to be placed in the user mailbox. And then the routing rules will kick in and forward that fax to an email. So once I've set this up in the mapping, I can move on to the final tab that we're going to use, and that is the Options tab. Now here at the top under the Ixware options, I can set a default user password and a default mailbox PIN code to be assigned to every mailbox. The user password is probably not important unless you're giving the Ixware workspace out as an application to your users. If you're installing it for users and they're actually opening up the Ixware workspace application, opening the mailbox to check for inbound faxes, then you might want to set a default password. If not, and it's probably the case because most people are using Outlook integration, having faxes forwarded to their email, they're sending faxes from email, they're not using the Ixware workspace as a user-based app, you probably don't need the password. Also, you can set a default mailbox PIN code. I generally don't do this either. One, most people aren't using a PIN code anymore to identify users at the MFD. However, if you are doing that, you probably have a unique PIN code for each user or for each department, and so setting a default mailbox PIN code doesn't necessarily help you. So generally I don't use these. What we do want to set are some rules here in the email gateway options, and the very first one is the most important: forward incoming messages to email. By turning this on, we're going to create a routing rule for each mailbox that we create, automatically forwarding inbound faxes to email. So I want to make sure I have this checked, and I think it's also a good idea to make sure that we check off the next two boxes, which are send delivery reports of outgoing messages and send non-delivery reports of outgoing messages to email. And if we turn all three of these on, we're going to make sure that inbound faxes get delivered to the user via email, and that any faxes the user sends from their desktop using say Outlook or a mail application, they're going to get a delivery report or a non-delivery report back to their email address for that message. So Once I've set all of these, I've got my email gateway options set up here. I've got my mapping set so that my mailbox transport is in place. My synchronization is done, my connection is done, I've done my check to make sure that everything's good. Then you can actually go ahead and force a sync by clicking on the synchronization tab and choosing the Run Now option. So if I click Run Now, once again it's going to say, do you want to save changes before performing this operation? We're going to click Yes, and we're going to synchronize with our LDAP server. And when that comes back as idle, we should be complete. So if I go ahead and click OK in LDAP, and I come down here to users, you'll see I now have a J. Whitefoot user. It's got my full name and a description that it's pulled from Active Directory. And if I go to mailboxes here under my site, you'll see that there's a J. Whitefoot mailbox that's been added. If I double click on this mailbox and go to addresses, you can see that I've added a fax transport for this mailbox, and because I chose my dial profile and I have number normalization set up in that profile, I've normalized this to international number format. And also, if I right click on that mailbox and I choose mailbox rules, you can see that we've automatically created a messaging rule. In fact, we preface it with LDAP so that if you create additional rules in the future, you know which ones were automatically built by the LDAP server, or excuse me, the LDAP module. And we're going to forward incoming fax messages to email, and you can see my email, it's pulled right from my Active Directory user. So that's it for the LDAP module. It does require a little bit of setup, but it is not as difficult as it looks. There's a lot of fields in there, but as long as you know the proper connection information to log into the LDAP server, the rest of it is fairly straightforward. You can also, one question I often get is, how do I know the name of the Active Directory schema? How do I remember the name so that I can filter on the fax server? And one of the ways you can do that here is if you go to synchronization, and I'm going to go back to advanced really quick for you, and if you don't have this facsimile telephone number option in here by default, which is the standard, right? So it ends at administrator. And I'll go ahead and click OK there really quickly. If you want to add that fax number, a really easy way to do that is to actually click on the mapping field, scroll down to the facsimile telephone number field, click on properties, and you can pull that LDAP attribute right out of the top there. So I can just actually right click on this and choose copy, cancel that, go back to synchronization, go to advanced, and you can click over here right at the very end between the last two brackets, and all you have to do is add an open bracket, paste in your facsimile telephone number, and then add equals, and in my case I did the asterisk for a wildcard, and then a close bracket. So that's a very quick way to get that facsimile telephone number in there if you're not intimately familiar with all of the Active Directory schema and their names. So I'll go ahead and click OK, do my check again just to make sure I've got it right, and I can see I got one item. So I know that I've entered my filter criteria correctly. So that's it for this technical webcast video on the LDAP site configuration. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in